Um, I would like to say good afternoon to everybody. It is a beautiful afternoon here, even though it's windy, but it's sun is shining, so it always makes me happy. Welcome to our very first webinar of 2021. My name is Ursula Wojciechowska, and I'm the co-founder of Women in World Trade. And I would like to acknowledge Leslie Griffin, my colleague in all things in world trade, who will be introducing our very special speakers today. So with that, over to you, Leslie.
Okay, well, thank you, Ursula. And thank you also, Elam, to you and your team for your help creating our website. We appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. We are pleased to be kicking off our 2021 programming with both a very timely topic and with two very distinguished speakers. As we know, the UK and the EU came to a last-minute trade deal on Christmas Eve, narrowly averting a so-called no-deal Brexit. And we're going to talk about that today and what this new landscape means for businesses, as well as for people, including professionals and travelers between the UK and the EU. We'll also look at sort of what it means for Britain's new freedoms and how they approach an independent trade policy and foreign policy toward the United States and the rest of the world. So to do that, we're very pleased to have with us the UK's Consul General to New England, Dr. Peter Abbott, who took up his post in September of 2020, following service in Islamabad, Pakistan, which I was interested to learn is the UK's largest overseas post. Prior to that, Peter served at the British Embassy in London. In Lisbon. Of course, he spent a lot of time in London too, at the British Embassy in Lisbon and at the British Embassy in Washington, where he was private secretary to the ambassador. For that US post, he drew on his experience working as an intern in then Speaker of the House, Denny Hastert's office, as well as on the gubernatorial campaign of Arianna Huffington when she ran for governor of California. So welcome, Peter. We also have with us Sarah Clegg, who is head of trade policy at the British Embassy in Washington, DC. Sarah arrived in Washington in October of 2017, a little over 3 years ago, following a position with the UK Home Office and service as a senior policy advisor in the UK Cabinet Office focused on EU foreign policy. So we will now get started, but in honor of our two British guests, I had to take out my Keep Calm and Trade On mug for all of us today. Okay, so let's do some stage setting and start with Peter. So Peter, the UK left the EU on January 31st, 2020, and this transition period was in place during which nothing was to change, and that was going to end on December 31st, 2020. Could you give us a high-level overview of the high-stakes negotiations that then ensued between the UK and the EU, maybe some of the UK and EU's priorities coming into those negotiations and their negotiating dynamics?
Great. Well, Leslie, thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction and for having myself and Sarah talk to you and to the Women in World Trade today. I'm very grateful for the invitation. As you say, it's very timely. So thank you to you, to Ursula, to Emily, and to all of those involved. It's great to be here. You're absolutely right in saying the UK left the EU on the 31st of January 2020, and that set the stage for a very intensive period of negotiations. I think it's fair to say a lot of people back at the beginning of last year weren't totally sure that it could be done. And I think, you know, it is testament to the efforts of the two negotiating teams that a deal of this sort and this magnitude was in fact done over the course of a 12-month period. The fact that it was left to Christmas Eve is no surprise to anyone who has been involved in any high-level negotiations in the past. It's always that sense of a clock ticking is always very important to give that sense of pressure, I think, and momentum to achieve that deal. You said we would have left under a no-deal scenario if we hadn't struck that deal. That's not strictly true. We would have left under the terms of the deal that was struck on the 31st of January 2020, and then we would have started trading with the EU on World Trade Organization terms, or, you know, to put it another way, in the same way that a country like Australia trades with the EU. But we knew we could do better than that, and we wanted to go several steps further than that. And in fact, that is indeed what we did. leaving the EU meant leaving a lot of things, leaving the single market, leaving the customs union. So it really was a lot needed to be unpicked. But I think, you know, what we wanted to try and do was to agree a deal that preserved as much of our relationship with the EU as we possibly could, that close relationship in lots of different areas, preserved as much free trade as we could, and allowed the UK to get back that national sovereignty that was so much at the heart of the 2016 referendum. And we think we did that. I mean, the agreement that we struck with the EU goes far beyond any other trade agreement that the EU has with anybody else. I mean, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but it's zero tariff, zero quotas, and it covers things that are sort of way beyond a standard FTA. You know, we've talked about fishing rights, energy and transport cooperation, law enforcement, judicial cooperation, those sorts of things. So it's really, really a very deep and broad agreement, and one that we think sets us up very, very nicely to continue that strong relationship that we've always had with the EU. You asked me a little bit about the dynamics between the two negotiating teams. I wasn't in either of those teams, but I think, you know, the word on the street, as it were, is that it was actually incredibly cordial. And went beyond just sort of mere professionalism to some really some strong relationships. I mean, people on both sides were incredible trade professionals with long careers in the area, and I think both sides really respected each other by the end of the negotiations. So it was really, I think, a mutual achievement is probably the best way of characterizing it.
Great. No, that's a great opening, and I think you're right to realize that to do a deal of that scope, it was like 1,246 pages with all the annexes, right? In such a short period of time with a COVID backdrop. You know, it is a testament to the negotiating skills and the commitment of both sides. So Sarah, as those negotiations sort of got toward the end game stage and everybody was sort of really leaning in, maybe you could remind everybody what were some of those sort of late stage issues that really took things down to the wire.
Yeah, can I just check that everybody can hear me? I'm not the most technically savvy person. I'm off mute. Yeah, perfect. And again, just to echo Peter's thanks for having us here today. It's really exciting to be speaking to you all. And Leslie, I don't think I've ever been called distinguished. That's the first time, so I'm gonna bank that. And then just on the deal, you know. Question whether the Commission President and Prime Minister wanted to give everybody an early Christmas present, but yeah, and just on your last point, we spoke to one of the kind of the top trade negotiators on the UK team who was dealing with the goods side of things, and he was really clear that actually the relationship with the EU and UK negotiators in the goods side was absolutely excellent, and actually they started to get frustrated as they were getting to the end game and everything was going really well on the goods side, and they kept getting these blockers on these end game issues, which I don't think it will have escaped any of your notice, but it basically came down to two things. One of them was fishing rights, and the other was level playing field issues. And on fishing rights, I mean, I think kind of fishing represents quite a small part of both the UK and the EU economies, but it's got a huge amount of political weight. It really punches above its weight politically. And basically what this came down to was kind of fishing rights for EU vessels in UK waters and UK vessels in EU waters under the Common Fisheries Policy, which was written in the 1970s. Basically all EU member state fishing vessels have equal access to EU waters. Now that became controversial in the end game of the negotiations, and where we got to was basically that EU fishing vessels would still have access to UK waters for a certain period of time, and that's up to 2026. But UK vessels would have kind of more or a greater share of the fishing rights in those waters, and there would be an adjustment period, as I said, up to 2026. And at the end of that adjustment period, there will then be kind of negotiations on fishing rights. So that's where we ended up on fishing rights. And then the other issue was level playing field. So all about kind of the regulatory regimes that govern trade in a way, and kind of making sure that there isn't unfair competition between EU member state businesses and UK. And I think where we started on this was the EU wanting the UK to have dynamic alignments on regulatory regimes, which would have meant that we would have been bound by future regulation, which we would have had no say in. And as Peter mentioned earlier, kind of one of the key things with regards to us leaving the EU was gaining back some of that sovereignty. So kind of the deal that's on the table, the deal that was agreed, does have stricter level playing field rules than the normal FTAs, but it does mean that the UK is not bound by EU regulation, and should we choose to kind of diverge over time, we are able to do that. And the European Court of Justice does not have a say over UK regulatory regimes. And then the second thing, and the big issue within all of this was obviously state aid regimes as well, and kind of the governance of subsidies. The UK, again, will not be bound by the EU state aid regimes, and we will be able to kind of devise our own modern subsidy system. But there are kind of safety valves in all of that. So there are kind of dispute resolution mechanisms and independent arbitration board, which kind of could be invoked if either side feels like the other side's businesses are kind of being treated more favourably, and there's a 5-year review clause as well in all of that. What I would say is with Northern Ireland, I think they are still they are carved out of some of the state aid rules, but not all of them, just because of kind of that unique position that Northern Ireland's in, but I think we'll get to that later.
And I don't think I heard you say that, so you do have the freedom to diverge from the EU rules and some of the principles, but the EU does have the ability, if you do that, and there's a fairly high burden of proof here, but they would have the right to impose tariffs if
Yes.
a panel were to judge that by cutting your regulations, say, or making them looser, that had given an unfair advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a right to kind of to impose countermeasures tariffs on both sides. Actually, the other thing that I should mention is there is a commitment by the UK government to maintain some of those really high labour and environment standards that we have and that we've had as part of the EU.
Okay, thank you very much. That was helpful. So, Peter, let's come back to you. So we reached this agreement, and it gets published basically days before it needs to take effect on January 1st of this year. So not surprisingly at all, we have seen disruption as traders come to grips with these new trade formalities. So, we have UK companies that are, although they may have been importing or exporting to the EU, now they're doing so as more sort of formal importers and exporters, right, with all the customs formalities and such that entails. So can you just talk a little bit about sort of the growing pains that we're seeing right now, and also anything the UK government is doing to help your UK traders adjust to this new environment?
Sure, Leslie, it's a great question. Those of you that follow UK news will have seen, a couple of stories, I think, since the Christmas period of some traders who have been having difficulty. In fact, my wife tried to send my brother a birthday present on Amazon, I think, and discovered that that present that she wanted to send was made in the EU, and there was some additional hoops to go through. So it sort of has a very kind of personal sort of concrete and tangible implications for some people. But I think, look, the contrast between those relatively small, relatively isolated experiences versus what would have happened in the case of not being able to reach some kind of trading agreement, it's just colossal. And actually, we've seen relatively few examples of where businesses have had difficulty trading or continuing to trade in the normal way. And it's part of that is because the government has spent billions of pounds, literally billions of pounds, over the last 12 to 18 months getting businesses ready for the transition. And obviously, we didn't know the exact terms of the agreement, but we knew we were going to leave the single market. We knew we were going to leave the customs union. So there were ways to prepare British businesses. And as I said, the government has spent billions, including on new customs infrastructure, for example. But there's a huge amount of information. I would say this to anyone who's interested in going down this route a bit further. There's a huge amount of information on the gov.uk website. Go sector by sector. There's a sort of it's called a Brexit checker tool, where if you're a business trading in the UK or trading with the UK or trading in the UK and trading with the EU, you can go online and it will tell you everything that you need to do in terms of all the forms and regulations and things that you need to comply with. There are also, I think, sector by sector hotlines as well that you can call up and get tailor-made advice if you need to. And we've tried to also stagger the government has tried to stagger the implementation deadlines for a lot of different things, so that it doesn't all flow, it doesn't all sort of fall on you on day one, that there are several kind of deadlines have been pushed back slightly to help cushion the blow a bit. The other thing I would say, and it's slightly closer to home, that if there is anybody listening in who has a company or has an issue, we'd be very happy to talk to you here at the consulate. And if anybody wants to follow up with me after this call, I'm very happy to put you in touch with our trade team here, who can help guide you through and help answer your questions.
Excellent. That's a great offer. Thank you. And Sarah, so there's been so much focus on goods crossing borders, but like New England, the UK is very strong in services, right? It's a big part of the economy. And I will say that, a lot of the trade press, has focused on the fact that the UK EU agreement doesn't have that much on services issues in terms of protecting UK service provider access to the EU. And I wondered if you can talk about, some of the uncertainty in that area and maybe some of the plans that are ahead of us to address that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you're right. I mean, I think the agreement that was reached is kind of probably goes further than any FTA in the world on goods, in the sense that there is zero tariffs and zero quotas, which is pretty amazing. I mean, what I would say is the agreement does contain well-established provisions on cross-border trade in services and investment that will ensure continued market access across a range of sectors, and that includes professional and business services, financial services, and transport services. It also includes obligations on market access to ensure that service suppliers don't face restrictions like economic needs tests, etc. And then we've scheduled new commitments on legal services, improved levels of commitment on transport and telecom services. There's provisions on business mobility in there, which include well-established commitments on short-term business visitors for establishment purposes, intra-corporate transfers, contractual service suppliers, and independent professionals, to make sure that there's no discriminatory barriers. And then there are commitments on length of stay that kind of broadly reflect the EU-Japan deal, which is kind of 90 days with any 180-day period. And then there are also provisions in there on mutual recognition with an agreed framework for the recognition of qualifications that goes further than recent EU FTAs. And that will also allows for improved mechanisms to be agreed in the future on a profession-by-profession basis.
Okay, very, very interesting. And actually, why don't I come to you, Peter, because I was going to ask you about this too, some of the people issues. So, Sarah's talked about professional certification. So imagine a UK architect who's certified to be an architect in the UK now is going to go over to Paris to help on a project. And can you just explain some of those issues, some of the travel issues, work visa kind of things that will probably be quite new to a lot of citizens on both sides of the channel?
Sure. Yeah, and it's I think it's important. I think always to remind ourselves that in leaving the European Union, a lot of the things that we took for granted will no longer be there. And I think for many people, free movement is one of the most totemic parts of the relationship with the EU that we have lost. But I think it's also worth remembering that in the referendum, precisely that free movement was one of the issues that drove the result of the referendum that we saw, because a lot of people, for the right reasons or for the wrong reasons, saw large numbers of people coming from predominantly Eastern European member states and willing to work for lower wages than British workers were. And so precisely that free movement of people that many of us are sort of we're missing now was one of the causes of the referendum result, I think, as we saw it. So there will be changes. It will be harder to move, but we have got visa-free access, as Sarah said, for up to 90 days in any 180 days. That's both for tourists and for some businesses as well. We've also got commitments on visa facilitation. So what we're going to agree is that where visas are required, they will be as smooth and as seamless and as easy to get as possible. And most of this shouldn't affect Americans travelling from here to the UK. This is a sort of a UK into the EU set of measures. So just to be clear on that, we've talked about mutual recognition of qualifications. Sarah's talked about the commitments to agree that it is difficult, and this is always a difficult part of any free trade agreement. But we start from a position where our qualification systems are very similar to those in the EU, and we hope that we should be able to find ways, sector by sector, to get those mutual recognition of qualifications agreed as soon as possible.
Good, that's helpful. And I read, which was interesting to me, that one of the reasons it's hard for the EU to negotiate on the professional certification issues is because they share their competence with the member states, and sometimes even private sector bodies within those member states are the ones that grant the certification to serve in a particular profession. So I thought that was interesting. So I want to go to an issue that really grabbed a lot of spotlight throughout, but also here in this country, and that's the issue of Northern Ireland that's sort of been alluded to a couple of times. Peter, can you explain to our listeners about the goal of avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland, why Northern Ireland became such a focus of the talks, and why it even resonated with some senior political figures here?
Sure. So, I mean, those of you on the line will, I'm sure, remember part of the recent history between the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland has been a very difficult history, particularly in the 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1980s, with a lot of violence in and around Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement was the solution to that, to those troubles. And the Good Friday Agreement was a very hard-won agreement. And it was done so with the sort of very close attention of a number of senior Americans. So George Mitchell, former senator, and of course President Bill Clinton as well, were both personally involved in those negotiations. And I think it's a combination of that, I think, that sense of a sort of stewardship of the Good Friday Agreement from the American side, and of course all of the incredible people-to-people links that there are between both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland with the United States, including here in Boston, where of course you've got very, very large Irish community. So a lot of interest from people like Richard Neal, Representative Richard Neal, who's very interested in this, both from his sort of, he's got that dual hat. He's in he represents the Irish caucus, but is also chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, so has a real interest in the trading side of things. So that's a little bit of the kind of sort of the US context. Your new president, of course, hails from Ireland as well. His family heritage is from Ireland. So there's just a lot of very personal interest in what happens on the island of Ireland. So in terms of the Brexit agreement, something called the Northern Ireland Protocol was agreed as part of the withdrawal agreement on January the 31st, 2020. And that we felt really sort of protected the integrity of the UK's single market and Northern Ireland within that, and reflected really months of work of something called the Joint Committee. And that protocol gave unfettered access for Northern Ireland businesses to trade with the rest of the UK market, and it also secured Northern Ireland's place in the UK's customs union and kept the sort of UK's territorial integrity, which, as you can imagine, was a pretty fundamental objective for the UK government as well. And it ensured that the smooth flow of trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain was maintained, and avoided the need for any kind of physical customs infrastructure between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But most importantly, it avoided the need for any physical infrastructure on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And that delivered on the high-level commitment that my Prime Minister made. In fact, several British Prime Ministers have made over the course of the last few years, and there have been a number of British Prime Ministers, to protect that hard-won piece that was secured by the Good Friday Agreement. And it was absolutely essential that we didn't see any physical infrastructure on that border, and that the flow of goods between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was as seamless as possible.
Great, that's excellent backdrop, and clearly that was a commitment that everybody felt most strongly about. And Sarah, so with that, help people understand then, so what are the practical dynamics of a trade border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, and sort of these single market rules that Northern Ireland will now need to adopt? How is that all going to work?
So, I mean, just to echo what Peter said on kind of the Good Friday Agreement and the need to kind of, you know, the UK's absolute kind of steadfast commitment to that, and that Good Friday Agreement includes kind of clauses on people connections, but also kind of making sure that there is free flow of goods in key sectors between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And there's a real special focus on agri-food actually there, because if you think about it, you might have kind of a cow farmed in Northern Ireland, the milk then gets processed on the island in Ireland, and then it comes back and it's turned into butter in Northern Ireland. So kind of that free flow of trade is really, really important. But as Peter said, kind of making sure that there was free flow of trade, or kind of as frictionless trade as possible between North and South, but also kind of East and West, which is where the unvetted access to the UK single market comes in. There is already some kind of border checks infrastructure in place, and what the UK government has basically said is we will not increase that will remain the same. There's also kind of, with a focus on that special status for agri-food, there is actually already what's called a single epidemiological area on the island of Ireland. And some cyto and phytosanitary checks already take place between Northern Ireland and the EU, and that will continue. But what we're trying to do is make sure that kind of there are any additional checks that are needed are as seamless as possible. And I think this will basically now come down to regulatory checks, because obviously kind of the deal that the UK has reached with the EU has kind of put in place zero tariffs, zero quotas. So this will be predominantly about regulatory checks, but we're trying to make it as seamless as possible. The UK government has kind of set up a special unit in the Cabinet Office that is going to support business with those checks, and it's also kind of put extra money into that. But I mean, you know, the upshot of this is no new infrastructure. Try and use kind of what's already there and keep checks to a minimum. There will be things like trusted trader schemes, electronic checks as much as possible. And then the only other thing that I think it's worth mentioning is that Northern Ireland will absolutely benefit from any new trade deals that are agreed between the UK and third countries.
Okay, great. I think you know, it's useful to hear that example you gave of dairy. So like another example, so this like a truckload of Northern Ireland meat gets put on a ferry down at a Dublin port and goes over to France, they would have no new paperwork or checks. But if a similar load is coming from Scotland and going to France, they would need sort of the export health certificates and, you know, maybe a border post where it might be physically examined, right? So that's kind of the distinction that Northern Ireland now is going to have basically have a different experience of Brexit than other parts of the UK. So thank you for that. That was a helpful explanation. So this is going to be sort of the last round on the agreement. I'd like to move forward to sort of what these new freedoms mean in other spheres. So actually, Sarah, if I could come back to you again for this next question. You know, the issue of Brexit has now moved off sort of front pages and sort of day-to-day headlines, perhaps, but really it's kind of we're just kind of starting, right? The sort of a set of kind of permanent negotiations with the EU about this new relationship. There are some sort of built-in provisions of the agreement that will require ongoing discussions. Kind of help us understand that, you know, we're really at the beginning of a sort of a new chapter, not ending talks with the EU.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, I think I'll just reiterate what you've mentioned there. You know, we've come from. It's a whole new world. You know, we've come from a very long period of integration with the EU, and this deal is good. It's really good, and as Peter mentioned at the beginning, you know, it's really good in terms of kind of trading goods, but it goes much beyond that. That said, it is different from being an EU member state and EU integration. And, you know, we didn't get everything we wanted in the deal. I imagine the EU side would say they didn't get everything they wanted in a deal. It's a strong deal. But, you know, it's different from the single market, it's different from kind of being a full EU member state. There is still some stuff to be negotiated, and fish data is one of those. So we'll have to see how that goes. And there will kind of, you know, as I've mentioned, this kind of, you know, the regulatory regimes and the fact that the UK, you know, will have its own sovereignty to diverge from that. We'll have to see where all of that goes. We're starting from a level of, you know, incredibly close alignment, but there are different sectors developing. There are future sectors, and how do we kind of work together to cooperate on the rules and regulations of those future sectors like AI, etc., will be interesting to see. And we will want to work very closely with the EU on those, I imagine. And then, you know, there will be teething problems, but I think at the moment we just have to bask in the kind of the glory of the fact that we've got this really, really good deal, and just kind of see where that takes us. But I imagine everybody will be working incredibly hard to kind of make this work and maintain that very close relationship with the EU.
Just to add, Leslie, if I may, I mean, one of the things that we'll be focused on immediately over the next couple of months is agreeing on financial services. So I think, you know, Sarah alluded to this earlier. We agreed a joint declaration on regulatory cooperation on financial services, and the view is to codify that in a memorandum of understanding that we will agree in March. And we hope that that will give much greater certainty to the financial services sector, which is the one that, as we've said, has been, you know, has not got the level of attention that the goods sector has had in the free trade agreement.
Peter, let me stay with you. So now we've talked about these newfound freedoms that that Britain has, and you're really starting with a lot of advantages, aren't you? Like, talk about Britain's place sort of on the world stage as you now start to forge some independent policies in areas where you used to sort of be under the EU umbrella.
Sure. Thanks, Leslie. It's always nice to have a sort of such a nice introduction to a question as that. I mean, you're absolutely right. The UK is the sixth largest economy in the world. We're a permanent member of the UN Security Council, one of only 5 countries in the world that can claim that title. We are the largest. We have the largest European military budget in NATO, so the largest contributor to NATO from a European point of view. We have world-class development, diplomatic and intelligence networks around the world that are pretty unparalleled and give us the ability to project influence in ways that most other countries are not able to do. We have an extraordinary military, not the largest military in the world by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the most advanced and one of the most nimble, and actually the only military in the world that is fully capable of fighting alongside the United States. The fact we have 2 new aircraft carriers that have just been put to sea and that are able to be fully interoperable with the US Navy and Air Force is a really remarkable thing. And I think, you know, we talk about the special relationship and we think it's about the bust of Churchill in the Oval Office or about whether a prime minister gets on well with the president. It's all sort of, it's a bit frothy, really. This is about really kind of hard ability to do diplomacy and project military strength and influence if we need to. The UK has other assets, of course, as well. People like to call us the soft power superpower. You know, we have the English language. We have you know, world-class universities, the top 10 universities in the world. 3 of them are in the UK, and 3 of them, of course, are sort of right here in Boston and New England. So we have a remarkable you know, higher education apparatus. We have great sports, great arts, great culture. All of that really, I think, really matters. And you know, this year, of all years, 2021, we're hosting COP26, which is the next major climate conference that's taking place in November in Glasgow. And that's an opportunity really to focus the eyes of the world on climate change and tackling climate change. And it's, you know, it's fantastic that your president has rejoined the Paris Agreement, and fantastic that he'll be such a partner as we head into those negotiations at COP26. But it's also a chance to showcase our climate credentials. The UK's it's called NDC. It's the I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it's our sort of environmental targets. The UK is cutting its carbon emissions faster than any other major country. We also have the world's largest amount of installed offshore wind capacity and the world's largest single offshore wind farm. We've got goals to make all of our homes in the UK powered by offshore wind by 2030, and we won't be selling any petrol-powered cars any new petrol-powered cars by 2030 either. So we're really setting the pace on climate, and I think that's one area where we can really use our convening power, our UN influence, and our relationship with the United States to really tackle the biggest issue facing our planet today. Other things I could talk about, COVID, the UK really leading the way in sequencing the genomes of so many of these different virus variants. It's why you hear people talking about the British COVID. Well, it's only called the British COVID because we were able to identify it because we have such a world-beating range of scientists and scientific institutions that are mapping these things. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is one of the 3 largest vaccines that have been developed. It's cheaper, it's easier to store and transport than the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine. And that means it's the vaccine that I think, basically we have to vaccinate the whole world before we're going to be over this pandemic. And having a vaccine that is cheap and easy to transport and store is the best way that we can hope to vaccinate the world. And the other thing that I don't think gets as much coverage as it should here in the US is that AstraZeneca, the British pharmaceutical company that has developed this vaccine, has promised to supply that vaccine at cost for the duration of the pandemic. So not making any profit on the sales of this vaccine. And I think that's really important. I think it's important that the UK has shown real leadership on COVAX. This is this global vaccine development and distribution organization. So really recognizing that we have a global role to play in helping recover from this pandemic. So lots there. Sorry, Leslie, you gave me sort of carte blanche to kind of talk about it. But lots of really fantastic things that I think position the UK extraordinarily well to make a huge success out of this year and out of our exit from the European Union.
That's an impressive set of assets that you have, and I actually am going to give you an invitation to add just a little bit on one piece of your answer, given that we are Women in World Trade New England. I know that you're very passionate about sort of the offshore wind issues and the renewable energy issues, and our collaboration as a region with the UK has a lot of promise. And we need to keep it a little bit brief because we've got one more topic I'd like to take up with both of you before we go to questions. But do you want to just add a word about the New England connection to your efforts?
Well, thank you very much, Leslie. I will.
Well, you're welcome.
So I think so. Wind power is really, really exciting, and I could talk for a long time about it. Some of the developments in the industry are extraordinary. So General Electric, which is headquartered here in Boston, have produced something called the Haladad X, which is a new turbine. One single turn of that turbine is enough to power 20,000 homes. So it's just, the technology is absolutely extraordinary. The cost of offshore wind power and electricity is coming down every year. It will soon be cheaper than petrol. And you have the opportunity here in New England to become the next global offshore wind hub, I think. The UK signed a memorandum of understanding with the state of Maine, back before Christmas to enhance our collaboration on offshore wind. University of Maine is developing a new floating offshore wind platform, which will further revolutionize the sector. And of course, we hope that Massachusetts will very shortly sign some really ambitious climate legislation here as well, which will increase the amount of offshore wind being used in Massachusetts as well. So lots going on in New England, and lots of scope for the UK to help work with you guys to share our experience and expertise.
That's great. Thank you. Now, I want to end on the topic of the US-UK trade negotiations. Could I ask you, Sarah, before we kind of dive into that, just very briefly, please, could you just explain what had to happen for the UK to be ready to start to launch an independent trade policy and forge agreements with other countries? Could you talk a little bit about these trade rollover agreements that you had to get in place so that you could protect the UK's access that you had enjoyed under the previous EU trade agreements?
Yeah, of course, I'll be as quick as I can on the rollover piece. But basically, oh, I'm really sorry. Can you hear that music in the background? I think my husband's trying to put my sons to sleep, and he's put some sleep music on.
It's not distracting, don't worry.
So, I mean, the first thing to say is, once the referendum happened and we're in this period where before we had actually left the EU, we couldn't negotiate. We were still a part of the EU for all intents and purposes, which meant that kind of, we didn't have the competence to negotiate on trade policy. Between the UK and the US, we set up what was called a UK-US trade and investment working group during that period, which had 4 purposes, basically. So one was to ensure continuity and certainty during Brexit. One was to look at how we could actually increase trade and investment or strengthen the trade and investment relationship during that period without stepping on the EU Commission's toes. And then there was certainly kind of like laying the groundwork for FTA negotiations so that we could hit the ground running as and when we left the EU, had the competence to negotiate, which did actually happen. And I would say that trade and investment working group really lay the ground to allow us to kind of launch negotiations virtually. Just on kind of the rollover piece, there's kind of, we had to look across the piece. The UK government did a massive mapping exercise of what are those agreements between the EU and third countries that really mattered. You know, and if you focus on the trade space, they are things like kind of EU free trade agreements with Japan, the CETA agreement between the EU and Canada. And we wanted to make sure that kind of we maintained the benefits of those agreements and that we rolled them over in inverted commas to make sure that kind of UK business maintained that access and the benefits of those agreements. And there's been a really good programme of rolling those agreements over. They've been tweaked in areas because you would expect that the other country would want to make some tweaks. But, you know, some of the key countries we've done that with are Japan, Mexico, Canada. And then the other thing we did certainly in the UK US space was make sure that any agreements that the EU had in place with the US in the trade and economic space and beyond, we maintained and we rolled over. And they are things like kind of air services agreements, trade in organics, veterinary equivalents, trade in spirits and wines, and kind of, you know, nuclear cooperation. And we've had a huge program. It's been a big piece of work for us, both in London and here, but kind of pleased to say that kind of those rollover agreements between the UK and the US are in place, which means that kind of the same access applies that did previously.
Okay, great. And that's a good lead into the subject of the US-UK trade negotiations. And I wanted to ask Peter, can you just kind of give us a high level take on, you know, what were the areas of alignment or areas of complementarity between our economies that led our two governments to say it would be a good idea to try to deepen our cooperation, better integrate our economies? What's the kind of the premise behind the US-UK FTA?
So, I mean, I think it's fairly straightforward. I mean, the UK and the US are an absolutely integral part of each other's economies. We are each other's biggest investors. 1 million jobs in each country are supported by this relationship, and we think an ambitious FTA could increase GDP in the US by about $10 billion. So we're not talking small change, and we think, you know, this is an argument that doesn't really, it sort of makes itself. To be absolutely honest, and we think also, I mean, sort of setting it in its broader context, signing an ambitious free trade agreement with the US like this will be, in many ways, one of the best ways to recover from COVID, and would send a really strong signal, a vote of confidence in the global free trade, and that this is crucial to any kind of global recovery. And I think we see pretty widespread support amongst Americans for such an agreement. I think something like more than 60% of Americans think a free trade agreement with the UK would enhance US global leadership. So there's sort of lots of really sort of economical reasons, but also geopolitical reasons why a free trade agreement like this makes sense.
Okay. I think that's right. So Sarah, so the agreement really argues for itself. You know, we started talks in May 2020. We're 5 rounds in. Now, I let Peter have the sort of the positive side of the ledger, but there are, of course, some challenges. You know, and for those of us who are very supportive of this agreement, you know, the challenge list may be a little bit longer than we would like. You know, obviously, with the 5 rounds under our belt, you know, the tough issues probably still lie ahead in areas like agriculture and pharmaceuticals and other areas. And then probably more significantly, the Biden administration has been increasingly direct in its statements about not intending to enter into new trade agreements as a near-term priority. But, you know, hope springs eternal, right? We have a time clock issue, though, that even were the Biden administration to make the decision, all right, we're going to double down and try to get this agreement over the finish line. Tell everybody about the time clock issue, about Trade Promotion Authority, used to be called Fast Track, and how that relates to these negotiations. I think some people have probably heard there's a deadline of July, and then you hear there's some other deadline of April. What's going on here?
Oh, this is where trade policy gets really interesting and geeky, isn't it? So, I mean, the first thing to say is just building on what Peter mentioned, that, you know, we have had 5 rounds. We started these negotiations in the middle of a pandemic virtually because of all the reasons that Peter set out. We've actually come a really long way. Like, it is amazing. It's been pretty much a kind of 24-hour negotiation. We've had a cadence of 2 weeks negotiating, 4 weeks between rounds. But in essence, there have been intersessional discussions with chapter leads in those 4-week periods. So a lot of ground has been covered. And basically, you know, the majority of kind of text has been agreed in a lot of chapters. Things like the SME chapter, you know, between these 4 virtual walls, pretty much closed. Yes, you're right. There are still some substantive issues to kind of to deal with, but, you know, our hope is that this is an attractive offer and it's far enough down the line to kind of for us to kind of get back to I say get back to the negotiating table. We've not really left the negotiating table, to kind of pick it up with the Biden administration. The other thing I would say is I think there's actually with the Biden administration some areas where we could go even further with and have even more ambition. So in, you know, kind of labour and environment standards, where I think we've put, you know, the UK has got high standards and we want to go further, but also on climate change. So kind of that's where we are, and that's why we think this is a fantastic offer. On Trade Promotion Authority, so this is the authority that is kind of that Congress gives to the executive to negotiate free trade agreements, to go off and negotiate them, so long as they are, I suppose, negotiated against a set of objectives for the trade agreements that were agreed by Congress, but also that the executive kind of comes back and abides by a process. So kind of sharing text with committees of jurisdiction, kind of laying text at certain points or doing reports at certain points along the way. And should kind of the administration abide by all of that, they have the freedom to go off and negotiate these trade agreements, come back, have the consultations with Congress, and then basically submit the implementing legislation to Congress, which then has kind of a smoother path, I suppose, through both chambers in terms of just a straight up or down vote and no amendments, which is obviously a preferred, you know, that feels like a kind of an easier pathway for a vote on a free trade agreement in Congress. So the Trade Promotion Authority, which is in place at the moment, is a 2015 Trade Promotion Authority, which expires on the 1st of July 2021. That would mean that any agreement signed before that date, even if it's signed on the 30th of June, could still be considered for fast track kind of processes in Congress, but it would have to be signed by that deadline. But there are things that would need to happen before that. So basically USTR would need to kind of notify Congress 90 days before its intent to sign that it was going to sign the free trade agreement, and it would then have to, 60 days before signature, would have to send the text of the agreement to Congress. So if you look at all of that, that basically takes you to the fact that, you know, you'd probably need to have any free trade agreement, I wouldn't say sign absolutely kind of sealed, but, you know, you'd have to have the majority of it sealed by the 2nd of April. If you look at that timeline with kind of the text then sent on the 2nd of May. I mean, you know, in terms of where we are on this, you know, we want to get talking to the Biden administration as soon as possible. We think we've got a fantastic offer, and actually, like I said, there's ambition, there's things that we can go further on where our policies align, but we're not going to be pressured by timelines. The most important thing in all of this is getting the right deal, getting that comprehensive and ambitious deal that works for the UK economy, but also the US economy. And I think our Secretary of State actually has just been on Bloomberg and has said exactly that, you know, yes, we want to get talking as soon as possible, but we're not going to be pressured by that timeline. I think the first step in all of this process will be kind of seeing Catherine Tyers and USTR Senate confirmed, and then our Secretary of State for International Trade kind of getting an early conversation with her and talking about our broad trade policy agenda, which will include the UK-US FTA. Absolutely.
Right. Well, you know, if we don't make it within this deadline, we can all hope that attention turns back to it, you know, as soon as possible. Because as you say, we got off to a good start, and there's been some important progress in the talks. I want to remind everybody that you can put, you know, I can continue with some questions, but you are more than welcome to put a question in the chat that I can pose to our speakers. And as I wait to see some pop in, maybe I'll come back to you, Sarah, on something that you raised. You mentioned that, in the absence of a free trade agreement, we do have this US-UK working group on trade and investment. And some of our listeners may not know that had COVID not taken over, we were due to host a US-UK SME, a small business forum here in Boston, under the auspices of that working group. And it was interesting because the focus was going to be on innovation and ties between sort of UK innovative companies and Boston's innovation ecosystem. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about innovation as a promising area for collaboration between the two countries and how we can each support our innovative industries.
Yeah, and I think that is a huge focus for the UK government. I think kind of recognition that we are kind of, two of the most innovative economies in the world. How can we use that to cooperate? And some of that might happen through an FTA, but a lot of it might not. I would say that kind of in terms of the FTA, what we're looking at is a future-facing FTA, and that, from our perspective, it would be great to include some stuff on innovation and how we cooperate on innovation in there. But there are also other avenues. I mean, as Peter said, we've got the presidency of the G7 this year, where there will be a trade track. And I think kind of our Secretary of State is quite keen for that trade track to focus on things like digital data, which is kind of the future as well, and kind of the green economy. I think she talks about trade as like a green, mean, can't remember what the other bit is, machine, but she's very focused on kind of like the green side of things, but also on kind of how digital trade can play a part in the future. And then the only other thing to mention is under the previous administration, we kind of started work on something called the Special Relationship Economic Working Group. Now, I mean, who knows where that will go under this administration, but basically the broad parameters of that were focused on kind of the bigger picture of how the UK and the US can kind of cooperate on some of these big questions, like what happens with AI, shaping future regulation, some kind of discussions on things like security of supply chains and certainly kind of post-COVID economic recovery. Now, they are all still things that we really want to cooperate with the Biden administration on, and some of that might, like I said, kind of might move forward in the G7, but it's certainly something that we're very focused on.
Peter, is there anything you want to add to that on the G7 or sort of on the innovation issues?
No, I mean, I think innovation runs through everything that we've been talking about in many ways. Some of the key chapters of the UK-US FTA want to look at digital services, for example, digital trade. There's an innovation component to that. There's an innovation component and a tech component to green power and clean energy. There's a really interesting area called the blue economy, where people are using kind of high-tech approaches to help with plastics in the oceans, for example, or to I was reading about a project recently that is designed to create high protein food from seaweed to help us. It may not sound very appetizing, but it help us deal with the problems of rearing cattle in the Amazon, for example. So there's a kind of a tech angle to all of this, and I think just to agree with you, Boston is absolutely at the heart of all of this. I think second only to Silicon Valley and the number of tech startups that are here, and the access to venture capital is extraordinary. I'm here in One Broadway in Kendall Square, and I think somebody told me when I first arrived that there's access to more venture capital in this building than the whole of Western Europe combined. So it's just an extra, and then you add on MIT and Harvard and Northeastern and Tufts, and you have this just extraordinary ecosystem of money, talent, and opportunity that just makes Boston such a fascinating place to be. And the UK can absolutely plug into that, whether it's AI or quantum or material science, whatever it is. We have some of the best scientists in the world that can work alongside your scientists.
Great. Well, I want to be respectful of people's time. We're at the hour. There's one question that came in that I want to particularly be sure to ask, because it's a representative of Invest Northern Ireland who's here in New England for the organization. And she asks if in the US-UK talks, has there been any discussion yet on sort of movement of people issues, given that maybe post-COVID, we may have consultants moving back and forth or tech folks trying to move back and forth. How has that, if that has been taken up, how is it being covered? And then we'll wrap up.
So, I mean, one of the things I would say, and this would obviously kind of come under the services piece, a huge objective for the UK in the UK-US FTA talks is on business mobility. We want to go further. We want to go better than the kind of the arrangements we've already got, because we recognise that that movement of people piece really supports business and helps them do well in trading across the Atlantic. So there have been talks on that. There's been, but we recognise that some of that is not actually within USTR's purview, and it's quite tricky. It's quite a tricky issue. So we're working on that. But yeah, I mean, it's a high priority for us.
Okay, great. Well, with that, if there's some questions we didn't get to, Peter was kind enough to say that he and his team could assist, so there could be some follow-ups there. But let me just say thank you very much to our speakers, to Peter, to Sarah, for making time for us, for doing a great job explaining a complex issue. But it's going to be exciting to see how the UK takes its new freedoms forward, and there's certainly a lot to be hopeful about in terms of our relationship, the United States' relationship with the UK. So thank you, everyone, and wish everybody a great afternoon.